They are a people frozen in time.
Very holy, humble, not proud, close to the land and close to God.
But hiding in their midst, a dark secret.
Who would imagine those people would be involved in drug trafficking? Who?
Disguised by tradition.
It was a complete surprise to us.
Protected by fear.
For $200, they can hire somebody to go to kill you.
An underworld crime syndicate worth millions.
Nobody's ever going to suspect that this farmhouse would be receiving 1,200 pounds of marijuana at this home.
Exploiting the most vulnerable.
It's one thing to be a crook, but it's another thing to enlist your children to become crooks too.
Terrifying those who investigate it.
Right there, I think, I'm just gonna die. This is where he's gonna pull out a gun and blow me away.
Executing those who snitch on it.
We tell them not to go to Mexico. That's not a smart thing to do.
He was electrocuted, castrated, ultimately murdered.
It's the world's most unlikely crime gang. Born from a conservative religious sect. And shipping drugs to a street corner near you.
This is sophisticated, it's complex, it involves tons of drugs, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Its name, the Mennonite Mob. Thanksgiving Day 1989. In northern Mexico, a simple farmer is on his way to the American border and into the history books.
Cornelius Bandman was a cattle farmer. He was married, he had children, he was church-going.
The church Bandman belongs to is one that most consider a pillar of virtue, an ultra-conservative Christian sect who, like the Amish, hold fast to traditional dress, customs, and values.
He was a devout Old Colony Mennonite.
People have the concept of Mennonites as being very holy, humble, not proud, close to the land and close to God, very religious folks.
But this Mennonite has a secret.
You could not believe this. It went against everything you imagined the Mennonite community to be.
Bandman's secret, 255 pounds of marijuana. Crime is the last thing most would associate with the Mennonite faith. Mennonites have been part of the North American landscape since the 17th century.
It's ultimately God who allows us to have all these good things.
Some, like this congregation in Seminole, Texas, are progressive in outlook, wearing modern clothes and speaking English. But others hold fast to an age-old farming lifestyle, rejecting some forms of technology, wearing traditional clothes, educating their children only to elementary school level, and speaking only Low German. They're known as Old Colony Mennonites.
Well, the Old Colony mentality is simple way of life. They really try to maintain their order or their way of life, their traditionalism. They really do try.
Born out of the 16th century Anabaptist movement in Europe, which also spawned the Amish, the Mennonite religion is named after Menno Simons, an Anabaptist priest from present-day Holland. A core belief of the Mennonite faith is that only adults can be baptized. They also revere family, hard work, and they're committed pacifists.
Some of the core issues that are very important and dear to an Old Colony Mennonite setting would be peace. Apart from that, retaining the Low German language is important. Retaining the traditional way of life is important. Low education in the Old Colony setting is important. And then, of course, the whole God-fearing religious component, church life, is important for anyone that is under the umbrella of Mennonite.
Mennonites are God-fearing, pacifist, and most people assume too morally pure to be tempted by crime. Until that incredible day in 1989, when Cornelius Bandman becomes the first Old Colony Mennonite convicted of drug smuggling in America. Even more amazing, Bandman's just the tip of a very big iceberg.
It's inconceivable, it's unimaginable that a community that has a fidelity to God and the land and hard work would turn to drug trafficking.
Police believe the drugs Bandman was carrying originated in Cuauhtemoc, Mexico. An Old Colony Mennonite community, now numbering 50,000, was established here in the 1920s by Mennonites from Canada.
They tried consciously and to separate themselves from the poisonous influences of the outside world.
Here in Mexico, the faith's true believers face hardship, much of it imposed by their religion.
There was a feeling in this community that the harder you worked, the more likely it was that you were going to get into heaven. So the elders in the community prohibited rubber tires on tractors because this would have made it very difficult to work the land, and therefore you were more likely to get into heaven that way.
One man whose place in heaven seems assured is hard-working Mennonite father Abraham Harms.
Abe was a church-going family man, devout Old Colony Mennonite. Abe kept, to some extent, simple, austere lifestyle that is the staple of many Old Colony Mennonites.
In the 1970s, Abe, like many of his kinfolk, earns a living from making cheese.
They develop a cheese that's extremely well known all throughout Mexico. Queso Mennonita is pretty much sold throughout the country.
Then in 1989, Abraham Harms packs a vehicle with fresh-made cheese and transports it across the U.S. border and into Canada, where he was born.
Like many Old Colony Mexican Mennonites, he enjoys dual Mexican-Canadian citizenship.
In a barn in southern Ontario, his customer waits. But it's not Mennonite cheese he's buying. It's Mexican dope.
What Abe did was he hollowed out the cheese wheel and placed marijuana inside the cheese wheel.
In this moment, Abraham Harms crosses the line from devout man of God to drug smuggler. And in the coming years, he'll assemble his fellow Mennonites into the strangest drug syndicate America has ever seen. But what drove this humble cheesemaker to begin dabbling in the world's most ruthless illicit trade? And what chance did this faith's strict moral codes have against the rise of the Mennonite mob?
I know what they're capable of doing down there. If they know that you know something, for $200 they can hire somebody to go kill you.
Across America, law enforcement are struggling to contain a drug syndicate that stretches from Mexico into every corner of the nation.
You know, it's kind of like you're putting your fingers in the dike when you run out of fingers.
Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines.
But this isn't any ordinary cartel. Its members come from a conservative Christian sect most consider morally pure. They're Old Colony Mennonites, operating like a mafia.
Mennonite Mob is real. It's long-standing, it's lucrative, it's ruthless.
So ruthless, law-abiding Mennonites fear they'll be killed for revealing its existence.
I know what they're capable of doing down there. If they know that you know something, for $200 they can hire somebody to go kill you.
This man grew up in a Mexican Old Colony Mennonite village and says drug running is rife in his community.
I mean, years and years ago, I remember they was really distant from all that, but over the years it just really exploded. And I think it's just out of control.
But how and why could members of such a conservative sect, associated with purity and piety, become involved in one of the world's most immoral and illegal trades?
Most people will look at these sort of bucolic scenes of Mennonites in their horses and buggies, and the women in their simple gowns. And that, for the longest time, was a pretty picture. But the picture has turned, to some extent, nightmarish.
The nightmare starts off as a dream of a new beginning in a new continent. Originally from present-day Holland, Old Colony Mennonites immigrated from Russia to North America in the 19th century.
I think our track record shows wherever we have been, whatever country we have been, we've never been violent.
But in the 1920s, their pacifist ways, along with their refusal to speak English, placed them at odds with some authorities.
There was a feeling like these folks needed to get more assimilated. Some people decided to do that, and a chunk of people really decided they did not want to do that.
So 5,000 Mennonites settle in Cuauhtemoc, Mexico, and begin farming. But by the 1960s, they begin to run out of land to work.
After a while, there really wasn't the same kind of land available to the younger folks that there had been to their fathers or their grandfathers years before.
Then in the 1970s and 80s, droughts sweep the Mexican countryside. Poverty and hunger take hold.
We couldn't win for losing. I mean, the house we lived in, there was no running water, there was no electricity. It was very poor.
Many of the Mennonites fell into destitution. They became poor. They couldn't live off the land. There had to be other ways to make money for their families.
Yet with limited education and no Spanish or English, the Mennonites' options are few. But there's one industry where lack of education and language isn't an obstacle to success. And in the 1980s, it's beginning to boom.
That's when it really exploded. That's when it really started coming out.
The 1980s sees the rise of Mexico's drug cartels, starting with Felix Gallardo, the former Mexican federal cop who is known as the Godfather of Mexican drug syndicates. As well as controlling all drug trafficking in the country, in the early 1980s, he cultivates a 2,500-acre crop of marijuana worth $8 billion called Rancho Buffalo, not far from the Mennonite colonies. Before long, some Mennonites realized dope could be an answer to their desperate plight.
The Mennonite godfathers feasted on this vulnerability.
In the 1980s, Mennonite father Abraham Harms begins smuggling marijuana to Canada in wheels of cheese. According to journalist Sam Quinones, he may have been motivated by money, but also by the value Old Colony Mennonite culture places on acts of boldness.
One of the ways you kind of show yourself to be a child of God and also kind of part of the Mennonite faith is you display a quality that they called narba. It's nerve. It's kind of backbone, you know, guts. It's one of the reasons also that drug trafficking took hold, because people didn't view it as this completely amoral thing to do. It was more of a display of your guts and your ability to deal with the world and flout the world.
Motivated by money or bravado, Abraham Harms begins his own drug syndicate. And he discovers in his community of ill-educated farmers a recipe already tailor-made for success. They're already farming. They just switch from corn to marijuana. They're already traveling to North America with furniture and cheese. Now, they'll just pack the goods with drugs. And to get past the border, they already have the most perfect disguise.
They went unsuspected, precisely because of the way they looked.
For a long time, these guys were kind of like given free pass through the border because no one could imagine that these Mennonites were drug traffickers. Because no customs agent really is going to suspect that a guy with a straw hat and overalls and rosy red cheeks and his wife with a bonnet and long flowery dress all the way down to her ankles and an old lady who's like 80 in the back seat is really involved in drug trafficking. And who would ever suspect that they have strapped around the grandmother a big pack of cocaine?
Harms starts small, enlisting trusted associates to package and traffic marijuana to Canada, where it's distributed into the community by other Mennonites. But in 1989, he makes his first mistake. He carries a load of dope himself and sells it to an undercover cop.
He was swept up in an undercover operation that was run by a Leamington police officer in southwestern Ontario.
Abraham Harms is charged with drug trafficking, but he quickly posts the $10,000 bail and skips back to Mexico. Abe's learned his lesson, and in the future, he'll get others to do his dirty work, including those closest to him.
Abe simply continued to do his work in northern Mexico, far from the clutches of law enforcement officials, and he then used his children as mules to try to ship drugs into the United States.
In 1993, Abraham's 17-year-old son Enrique is caught on the Mexican-U.S. border with 90 pounds of his dad's dope. He does time in a Mexican prison.
It's one thing to be a crook, but it's another thing to enlist your children to become crooks too. So that tells me that he was prepared to do anything for money.
As his son languishes behind bars, Abraham maintains the facade of a faithful Mennonite. And church leaders' attempts to stop their flock entering the drug trade fall on deaf ears.
The pastors have tried. Every Sunday at the sermon, they might make mention of what's going on. They've reached out to some of the key Mennonites who were involved and asked them to stop what they're doing. Indeed, I spoke to a pastor who approached Abe Harms and tried to get him to stop, obviously with little success. The lure of money is just too great.
Some Mennonites pay a heavy price. Between 1989 and 1995, U.S. and Canadian customs catch at least 30 of them smuggling drugs. But the rise of the kingpin Abraham Harms seems unstoppable until a November morning in 1994.
My understanding was he was headed to church, and it was a Sunday morning when it happened.
Abe may have been a drug trafficker, but he was a churchgoer too. And he was still a devout Old Colony Mennonite insofar as that he believed in the Lord.
But today on his way to church, Abraham Harms mysteriously loses control and crashes.
He may have been drunk or high on drugs or a combination of both.
There's another theory that Harms was run off the road and killed.
Others believe that it wasn't an accident, that he was in fact murdered. And ironically, a Bible was found a stone's throw away from his body.
As the godfather of the Mennonite Mob lies dying, it seems the syndicate he founded might die with him. Because in the Mexican drug industry, a new, more ruthless age is dawning. A vicious world of multi-ton deals and massacres, where there'll be no place for a syndicate spawned from a quaint, pacifist Christian sect. Or will there?
Nobody's ever going to suspect that this farmhouse would be receiving 2,300 pounds of marijuana, 1,200 pounds of marijuana at this home.
We were told that he was electrocuted, castrated, ultimately murdered.
In the late 80s and early 90s, a drug smuggling syndicate is born in the most unlikely society. Among pious, conservative, old colony Mennonites.
It bothers me a lot that our backgrounds is just falling completely apart, that they're completely into that instead trying to move ahead legally.
They became expert at the entire complicated infrastructure of drug trafficking. The simple people. It's unbelievable.
Then, in 1994, Mennonite mobster Abraham Harms is killed in a car wreck. And pastors pray Mennonites' involvement in this ungodly trade will die with him. But 5 years later, in Thomas, Oklahoma, there's a sign those prayers may be in vain. Police Chief Ronnie Jackson makes what he thinks is a routine traffic stop. He pulls over a Mennonite farmhand, Abraham Wiebe.
Just a laborer. He worked for a local farmer.
Wiebe's driving without a license. He lost it a year back in a DUI.
I told him to take his vehicle home and park it. He said that he would.
And then, perhaps in an attempt to avoid being booked, Wiebe says something strange.
He said, "I'm going to tell you something that's going to make your career."
Wiebe tells Jackson to meet him that night at his home.
I showed up and we began talking about what he knew.
Wiebe's secret? He's got inside information on a syndicate bringing tons of drugs into Oklahoma from his former hometown in Mexico. A syndicate run by old colony Mennonites.
To this day, when I speak of Mexican Mennonites as drug smugglers, people are shocked.
Narcotics agent Cindy Cunningham had been trying to crack Oklahoma drug rings for over a decade. She'd never heard anything like this.
One day we get a call from Ronnie Jackson, and he said he had stopped Abraham Wiebe, who happened to be a Mennonite, had information about Mennonites from Cuauhtémoc, Chihuahua, smuggling drugs from Mexico throughout the United States and into Canada. So it was a complete surprise to us.
Could the Mennonite mob still be active and now be operating in rural Oklahoma? And if it was, who was the kingpin behind it all? To answer those questions, Oklahoma drug agents begin a complex undercover operation. They secure a remote rural house, tap its phones, wire it up with surveillance, and put inside it the man who tipped them off in the first place.
Abe was the contact person for the organization that was shipping the drugs into Oklahoma.
Abraham Wiebe has agreed to cooperate with cops by running a so-called stash house for the Mennonite mob. He tells cops he's motivated by a desire to do the right thing by his people. But as a police informant, his life is at risk every moment.
If they even have a hint that you're cooperating with the police, you know, you're done.
At first, the only activity is late-night phone calls.
He would be contacted by that group and told that a load's coming in today.
Then the drugs start arriving in amounts that are staggering.
When the load of drugs would come in, Abe's responsibility was to unload it from whatever it was concealed in. And sometimes it was in fuel tanks in the back of a pickup or in the wheels of the vehicle that it was brought in, or in the semi that brought it into the States. He was responsible for unloading that and then repackaging in 1 or 2 pound packages.
This Oklahoma drug agent helped run the wiretap operation.
Well, for us, when we first started with the case, to even hear Mennonites involved, it was out of the ordinary.
Because of threats on his life, he doesn't want his identity revealed.
Nobody's ever going to suspect that this farmhouse would be receiving 2,300 pounds of marijuana, 1,200 pounds of marijuana at this home.
The investigation reveals that the tiny town of Thomas, Oklahoma, is being used as a drop-off point for Mexican-grown marijuana. Truckloads of it.
So we'd back up to the barn, they'd close it, unload it, walk over to the house, obviously they'd package it, and all the dope was stored in the attic of the house.
We had a flatbed that came up here 2 different times, and it had about 1,000 pounds each time. The largest load we took off had a ton.
For Western Oklahoma, there's probably never been a case this large with those amounts.
Using small towns instead of large ones as trafficking hubs is a relatively new method for sophisticated drug cartels. A method that makes sense because outside of the major metropolitan areas, smugglers believe they'll be able to operate under the radar.
One of the new trends that Mexican trafficking now uses small towns as hubs for drug distribution. What used to be that the smaller towns were the destination point, that's where people would buy and use the drugs most of the time. Now those are the areas, particularly the rural small towns, where people send their 30 kilos or their 50 kilos of whatever, and they break it up into 2-kilo loads, and they take some over here and some over there. The reason is because they know, I think there's a general realization the cops are outgunned, outmanned in those areas. And it's a real new trend, last 10 years or so, maybe, and growing, I think.
And within weeks, agents have the name of the man said to be sending all these tons of drugs north. To cops in Mexico and Canada, it's a family name that is chillingly familiar.
We identified him through these series of wiretaps, as well as the information we got from Abraham Wiebe.
The alleged kingpin's name is Enrique Harms. The former teenage drug mule has taken his father's place at the top of the Mennonite Mob.
Well, after Abe's death, I suspect that there was a period of mourning, but Enrique became the head of allegedly the drug trafficking syndicate in Cuauhtémoc.
A new leader heralds new, more sophisticated methods for the Mennonite Mob. Gone are the days of cheese wheels and Chesterfield sofas. Now Mennonites use their skill with machinery to hide the dope deep inside vehicles.
One concealment method was the wheels of the vehicle. They would take the tire off the wheel and construct a round tube that would be welded to the rim of the vehicle. In that tube, marijuana would be packed. They would put the tire back on, air up the tire, and then place it on the vehicle, and you could drive on those wheels.
Another method involves stripping the floors out of semi-trailers.
They would remove it, and it would expose the frames of the trailer, which were tubular. And then they would just place packages of marijuana as far as they could push them into the tubes, and then put the tailboard back on, and you would never know that anything was in it.
And though traditionally Mennonites stayed with their own kind, Enrique has strengthened his syndicate by forging links with Mexican cartels, including the notorious Escajeda family of the Juarez cartel.
This was the first time since I've been here, since 1980, that we were able to actually link people in Oklahoma back into cartels in Mexico. So this was really a substantial case.
And more strange, of course, because it's all coming out of this religious community known for piety, for humility.
After 6 months, cops bring the Oklahoma operation to an end, arresting 15 of the syndicate's drug wholesalers and drivers. But there's one Mennonite they can't touch, and another they can't protect.
He wanted to go back to Mexico. We told him not to go to Mexico. That's not a smart thing to do.
I said, don't. I said, you know what you did? I said, don't go down there.
Farmhand Abraham Wiebe had informed on his own kind, blowing open a drug network operating within his seemingly devout Mennonite sect.
Wiebe was the Oklahoma police's guide into how extensive the drug trafficking network was.
For 6 months, Abraham Wiebe had been working with the Oklahoma drug squad to run a stash house for the Mennonite mob, receiving and distributing thousands of pounds of drugs.
This was an eye-opener to the fact that this type and quantity of drugs were actually coming into Oklahoma. It wasn't just something that you see on TV. It was real.
In late 1999, the operation is brought to a close. 15 drug runners are arrested, but cops can't reach those who are still in Mexico, including the alleged kingpin, Enrique Harms.
He was the head of the organization. I've been told that he's very powerful and controls a large drug organization and a lot of people working for him.
After the Oklahoma bust, the informant Abraham Wiebe is offered state protection and advised to go into hiding.
We told him not to go to Mexico. That's not a smart thing to do. You need to stay here, in Oklahoma, or we would send him someplace and set him up.
But Wiebe doesn't think he needs protecting. After all, the Mennonites have always been pacifists. To engage in violence would break with 500 years of tradition.
He told me I'm going to go to Mexico. And I said, no. I said, you can't. I said, there's no way. He said, nobody is going to tell me what to do. He said, I'm grown. I said, do it at least for your kids. I said, don't.
This man is a former associate of Abraham Wiebe. He does not want his identity revealed because it might risk his life.
I said, you know what you did? I said, don't go down there. I told him straight up, I said, all the families, they know what happened here. And I said, all of a sudden, you're going to show up? I said, that's not going to work. Don't do it. And he left that evening. And I said, I don't think we'll ever see him again.
Wiebe travels to Cuauhtemoc, Mexico, his hometown and birthplace of the Mennonite Mob.
Probably part of him believed that they were still faithful, that they would forgive him. Because he likely thought that, well, they are Mennonites. They are like me. They can't have abandoned all of their faith, all of their belief, all of their pacifism.
After arriving in Mexico, Wiebe is seen drinking in a bar in a border town.
He gets drunk, and while he's drunk, he confesses his role as an informant to other Mennonites.
Soon after, Abraham Wiebe, the man who informed on the Mennonite Mob, disappears.
We were told that he was electrocuted, castrated, and ultimately murdered and dumped into a lake. His body has never surfaced.
To the family, there's never been any closure.
For Abraham Wiebe's grieving friends, only scars and fear remain.
So, are you afraid?
Yes.
Are you fearful for your family just because you knew him?
Yes.
Discarding 500 years of pacifist tradition, the Mennonite Mob have proved they can adapt to drug trafficking's new, more violent age. And now it's not just informants who need to beware of their wrath. It's American reporters, too.
Right there, I think, I'm just gonna die. This is where he's gonna pull out a gun and blow me away. Right there, it's what's gonna happen.
In the late 1990s, a drug kingpin rises out of a conservative Christian sect renowned for piety and pacifism. His name is Enrique Harms, and he'll shatter every code of the Mennonite faith in his scramble to build a drug syndicate worth millions.
He's alleged to have expanded the network in the United States, so they're going to more cities, selling in more towns.
But like any successful businessman, Enrique must also learn to adapt to market forces.
In the late 1990s, the Mennonites had to change tact because the US market and the Canadian market was being flooded with high-grade marijuana that was being produced in British Columbia. It's more commonly known as BC Bud. And the kind of the seedy, low-quality Mennonite dope was being pushed out. So they needed to diversify.
Enrique Harms also expands by handling harder drugs like cocaine. And when a police wiretap operation knocks out one of his supply hubs in Oklahoma, he just creates a new trafficking route further west through Colorado.
So they're constantly shifting these routes, like any expert drug trafficking network. They're not a static organization. They're an organization that adapts and changes its tactics, particularly how they route drugs into and out of both Canada and the United States.
My impression that Enrique Harms is kind of like, was the mastermind behind all this. The guy who had most vision and entrepreneurial vision over what was possible and what could be done.
According to some, in the formerly pious Mennonite colonies of northern Mexico, drug running has become deeply ingrained.
It wouldn't surprise me if there's not like 10 or 15%. They're heavy in it. They drive brand new vehicles and dark windows. When I go to my families, they just say, "Oh, did you hear about him? He's big involved in shipping stuff to the States." You hear that constantly.
Journalist Sam Quinones first hears of Old Colony Mennonites' association with the drug trade in 2004. Like everyone else, he's amazed.
I was just blown away. I just could not believe it. And I began to think, wow, that is a great story. I gotta go do that story. This is fascinating.
To find out more, Quinones travels to Enrique Harms' hometown of Cuauhtemoc, Mexico. But he finds it's a community that doesn't give up its secrets easily.
It was not a world where I had any entree. It was a low German-speaking, very cloistered world.
Quinones starts probing about drug smuggling, but hits a brick wall. Then he makes the mistake of mentioning the name, Enrique Harms, to a restaurant owner.
And I say to him, and if Enrique Harms wants to speak to me, here's my card. I was just clearly perceived as a threat.
Encountering hostility, Sam decides it's time to leave town.
About a half mile after the restaurant, I look in my rearview mirror, and I'm being followed. I begin to get seriously terrified. At some point, I realized, I gotta do something here. I grew up in the 1970s watching all those detective movies, and so I start to do like these, what I take to be some kind of evasive maneuvers or some damn thing, right? So I make a right turn and then a left turn.
For a moment, Sam thinks he's escaped.
Get to a stoplight. I'm sitting there in my car, waiting for the light to change, waiting to get on the highway, to head back to Chihuahua City, to take my airplane out of there. And this guy pulls up right next to me. Right there, I think, I'm just gonna die. This is where he's gonna pull out a gun and blow me away. Right there, it's what's gonna happen. He pulls out instead a digital camera and starts aiming it at me and clicking and bam, bam, bam.
Is the photograph destined for a hitman tasked with assassinating this nosy journalist? Quinones doesn't wait to find out. He calls a contact in Mexico City who arranges a police escort to the airport.
The whole time we're being followed. We get to the airport. I give these cops every dime I have on me. I say, thank you. I don't know how else to thank you. Here's all the money I got. And I run into the airport.
As the plane banks into the Mexican sky, Sam vows never to return to the hometown of the Mennonite Mob.
You could not pay me to go back to Cuauhtemoc, Chihuahua, as beautiful as it is, ever again.
With the perceived threat gone, Enrique Harms allegedly resumes doing what he does best: figuring out new ways to get drugs into America. But what happens when American drug enforcement wise up to Enrique's new supply route through Colorado?
They were trying to spirit into Colorado tons of marijuana and cocaine.
Is this the end of the line for the kingpin of the Mennonite Mob? From making cheese to making millions, the devoutly Christian Mennonite community Enrique Harms was born into has provided the perfect cover for an international drug network.
This is sophisticated, it's complex, it involves tons of drugs, hundreds of millions of dollars.
In the early 2000s, it's estimated by Ontario cops that up to 5,000 Canadian Old Colony Mennonites are involved in the drug trade. By the late 2000s, at least 100 of Harms's kinfolk have served prison time because they've run drugs. Try as he might to keep his syndicate low profile or masked by their traditional farming lifestyle, Enrique's Mennonite Mob are firmly on law enforcement's radar.
We know that they migrate from Canada to Mexico in the winter months. They grow crops down there, and then they come back across with drugs, and of course they bring money south.
No longer are traditionally dressed Mennonites given a free pass through the border, and the vigilance is paying off. In a September 2013 bust, DEA agents in Colorado seize 11,000 pounds of marijuana and 30 kilos of cocaine. 7 men are indicted for drug trafficking by a grand jury, including the Mennonite mobster Enrique Harms.
Enrique Harms and his alleged co-conspirators were indicted on trying to spirit into Colorado hundreds of tons of marijuana and cocaine.
As he has in the past, Enrique Harms evades capture by remaining on Mexican soil. To journalist Andrew Mitrovica, the indictment is more proof of the cancer eating away at the Old Colony Mennonite community.
And anyone, including members of the Mennonite community, who try to dismiss this as either a mirage or some kind of rumor, are acting like the proverbial ostriches in the sand.
And according to one young Mennonite, involvement in the drug trade is spreading to the next generation.
The young människor de säger att man kan stå ett young jobb från 15-18 år young så. Det down the range de mer än fan vad det. Det var down the down just det har som.
What is time for? And this wise man in Ecclesiastes chapter 3.
Meanwhile, those who stay true to the traditional values of the Mennonites are concerned that a criminal minority may tarnish the integrity of this ancient faith.
The Mennonite people and the Mennonite faith will be labeled through some of the activities that are happening through those that engage in unacceptable or illegal ways of life. That's for sure.
Brother, how are you?
But it's not part of our lifestyle, it's not part of our faith, and I think our history speaks for itself. But why some people would engage in that, I don't know.
Though the vast and overwhelming majority of Old Colony Mennonites are upstanding and law-abiding, it's feared by some that the outlaw gang operating in its midst may be growing stronger. For Americans and their law enforcement, that's cause for concern.
I've had a couple of threats with this particular group to kill us. But I think there's a little bit of courtesy there because we don't lie, we don't steal from them. Pretty much it's our job to do this. It's their job, if you want to say, to smuggle drugs into the United States.
For Enrique Harms, that job has paid off. Turning his back on the high moral codes of his ancestors, on their commitment to hard work and their pacifist roots, his lifestyle flies in the face of 500 years of tradition.
Enrique, unlike his father, appears to enjoy flaunting his wealth. He's also, according to law enforcement officials in the United States and Canada, bought strip clubs, built an ice rink, cars, jewelry, all of the sort of the stereotypical trappings of an alleged drug kingpin. Enrique apparently is lavished upon himself.
He certainly lived a long life down there. We see so many homicides, drug-related homicides down there, which tells me if his life hasn't been jeopardized, that he is pretty well entrenched down there with the cartels.
To many, Enrique Harms embodies all the vices the Old Colony Mennonite faith tried to protect its people from. And now that he's on the top, the only question for the kingpin of the Mennonite mob is, will American justice ever bring him down?
I think Enrique Harms is living comfortably in northern Mexico, safe from the clutches of U.S. and Canadian authorities.